Thank you and welcome everyone to tonight's public quarterly forum for the Citizens Oversight Board. This is December 9th, 2020, and this is the virtual platform that we're using for obvious reasons. Normally, we're able to meet in person and see the faces of the citizens, but as we know, we've all had to make quite a few changes this year and adapt to what's going on. And this is one way for us to remain connected with the citizens of Denver and still be able to talk about things that are appropriate and definitely touch the lives of us all here in the city. So welcome. Real quick, I'd like to introduce the board. And after I introduce the board, I'll introduce a couple of other officials that we have on tonight. And then I'll go through the duties of the Citizens Oversight Board, and I'll talk through those because I'll take this opportunity to really kind of explain what the COB does. I think many times you'll hear the name and you know that we're there, but there have been many times where folks have asked, well, what exactly do you do? So I will cover that, and then after that, we will hear from Nick Mitchell, which is our independent monitor, who will be have the presentation for the night and go into questions. So I have with me tonight 7 members of our board. Our board will be expanding to 9 members, hopefully here shortly. But the 7 tonight are Julia Richmond. There she is, waving her hand. Now, maybe that's something good for all of us to do a little hand wave. Molly Gallegos, Karen Collier, Terrence Carroll, and our vice chair is Nikki Brazil. And we have, am I missing someone? Oh, April Alexander, Dr. April Alexander. I'm so sorry. I'm like, why didn't I write that down? And our past board chair is Katina Banks, who will be joining us shortly. I had wanted to take a moment too to thank her for her service over the past years publicly when she joined here tonight. Katina has been very instrumental in a lot of what we do as a COB and the structure of it. And in handing the baton off to me this year, I had big shoes to fill. So Katina Banks, who will be joining us later. And I'm the board chair. I'm the board chair with Al Gardner. So I'll be moderating tonight's meeting. Duties of the Citizens Oversight Board. The city ordinance that chartered the Citizens Oversight Board and the Office of the Independent Monitor fixes 3 responsibilities for the Citizens Oversight Board. The first one is to assess the effectiveness of the Independent Monitor. That is our first job. The second is to issue policy recommendations concerning discipline, use of force, rules, hiring, training, and the community relations of Denver Police, Denver Sheriff, and certain Denver Fire Department personnel. 3 is to consider issues of concern to the community, stay informed regarding the complaint and process, and make recommendations concerning specific cases reflected in complaints. The board has no command responsibilities with respect to law enforcement department or personnel. We carry out advisory duties in frequent meetings and consultations with the monitor and the members of the safety department. At least quarterly, the board meets with the director of safety, the chief of police, and the sheriff. The COB typically meets on the first and third Fridays of each month in regular working sessions. And just as we're doing this session today via Zoom, we also are carrying out, until further notice, our meetings will be virtual as well. Those meetings can be found on the Citizens Oversight Board website on the Denver City page, and our links are typically in there for you to be able to click and join, as well as if you want to take a look at past meetings, past forums, and agendas. The COB is also tasked with conducting at least 3 meetings each year for public comment, which this is one of them. And it looks like Katina Banks has joined. So, hi, Katina. And everyone is here now. Now, tonight with us, we want to recognize we have Sheriff Elias Diggins, who has joined us tonight. He is on with us, so thank you, Sheriff. We have Councilman Cashman, who has also joined us tonight. Thank you for joining us tonight, Councilman. And of course, we have Nick Mitchell, who is also here, which is our independent monitor. And for a matter of order, just to let you know, the Chief of Police, Chief Paul Pazin, was invited tonight by the Citizens Oversight Board, and we had hoped that he would be here. However, he did decline being here this evening. So keep that in mind as you're asking questions and as you're able to submit Q&A. We will try and go as far as we can in terms of answering the questions that we can answer to the best of our abilities. Also invited to the forum tonight was the Director of Safety, Murphy Robinson, and he also declined to attend tonight. Both of them referred back to their statement to OIM that was submitted yesterday in writing. And so any type of answers to your questions, we would have to direct back to their statements. So tonight's presentation for tonight's forum features the Denver Independent Monitor, which is Nick Mitchell, on his office's independent report regarding the police response to the 2020 George Floyd protest in Denver. From this point on, I'll give the floor to Nick Mitchell, and after him, we'll reconvene with questions. Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and attendees. I'm going to ask Matt, who's on the call, to share his screen. I understand he's not able to do that. Julia, are you able to rectify that?
Yeah, give me a second, or Matt, if you wanted to share the materials with me, I can make that work.
So while that kind of technical issue is being worked out, let me just say again, thanks to everyone for being here, for being engaged in these issues. I'll plan to run through a presentation that summarizes the report that we issued yesterday, talks at a relatively high level about the findings that we made, with the goal of leaving enough time in this meeting for Q&A and discussion between, with the board and with others in the crowd. So, I guess first thing, while they're trying to work out this technical issue, let me say that, let me just give a little bit of background. So we, by the City Council in June to conduct an investigation into and review of the police response to the protests that occurred in our city from May 28th through mid-June. I don't think I need to provide a lot of context for the folks on this call. I think people are well aware of probably many of the reasons why people were engaged in protest. Of course, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota was a precipitating event, though certainly not the only event that drew people into our streets. How's that coming along with the slide deck?
Matt, go ahead and give that a try. Just change some settings. And if you can't make that work, there we go.
All right. Very good. Next slide, please. So, by way of context, again, the demonstrations were, largely characterized by peaceful demonstrations, particularly during the day. Um, they were extraordinarily large. We had as many as 10,000 people in our streets, and maybe more on certain days. At night, there were often eruptions of violence and violent clashes in the streets between attendees and police officers. There was significant property damage created both to private property as well as government buildings. And the demonstrations that happened in our city were unique in a number of important ways. First, historically, protest in Denver has often been sort of directional. There's been a point A and a point B. There's been a march that began in a certain location and ended in another, with sort of organized speeches and other events at the second location. And while there certainly was organization in the protest, and there certainly were speeches, the protests were sort of multi-directional. They occupied a lot of space downtown. There were groups that moved in different directions throughout the downtown area. As it became sort of clear in our review and in this investigation, that had a significant impact on the response of the Denver Police Department to the demonstrations. Next slide. We focused our review on the first 5 protest days. While we would have liked perhaps to do a review of the police response to the entirety of the protests, given the resources available to us and the fact that we have a number of other projects ongoing, as well as a full docket of investigations, I made the decision that we would focus on the first 5 days, given that was when most of the police use of force and much of the sort of, many of the clashes between police and community occurred. And during those 5 days, the police department made 339 arrests, mostly for curfew violations, though also for other charges. We looked at metrics concerning the protests in general. We obtained data from the fire department and other sources. The fire department responded to more than 200 calls related to fires during the protests, and there were 39 guns seized from the streets during that period. There also were significant injuries to both protesters and police officers. So there were 81 officer injuries reported by the police department. 11 officers were placed on limited duty, and 4 took time off for injuries that they sustained while engaged in police work during the protests. Next slide, please. There were also many serious community member injuries, although it was impossible for us to know the precise number. We requested and obtained data from Denver Health related to calls from the paramedic division, which made 125, responded to 125 calls during the first, I don't think that was for the first 5 days, but that may have been for the first 9 or 10 days of the protests. Of course, we're sort of well aware that many community member injuries were not reported, so the number of injuries is likely far higher than 125. There were many complaints and concerns raised about police conduct during the protests. Some of them were complaints of a sort of general nature. Others were specific, particularized allegations of misconduct, excessive force, and the like that were made to the OIM. Some may have been made to the COB. I know that some were made to the City Council. Of those, the Internal Affairs Bureau opened over 100 investigations. Some of those have been closed already, as I'll discuss later in the presentation. More than 50 investigations remain open to this day, and they're being conducted by Internal Affairs with oversight from my team. There was also, as I mentioned, significant damage to government property and private businesses, as we set forth in the report. And as we look to sort of map the impacts of the protests, another metric we used was the litigation that has resulted. 3 lawsuits have been filed so far, and more than 50 notices of claim. have been served upon the city. So as I mentioned in my presentation this morning to the Denver City Council, there is a wave of litigation coming related to these protests and claims made particularly regarding police conduct during the protests. Next slide. So to do this investigation, we were under I won't call it a mandate, but we were asked by council to do it quickly, to do it thoroughly. And we tried to do that. And I suppose that I should say, in the course of our work, we made numerous requests for documents and video and other information of the police department. It was my impression that the department shared information with us freely and provided interviews of personnel at ranks throughout the department, as well as again documentary evidence and footage. We also received significant information and cooperation from community members, and I want to thank and recognize the community as well as the police department for sharing information with us. We reviewed police policies, procedures, reports, rosters, inventories to the extent they were available. I won't sort of go through each sort of item of evidence here. Hundreds of hours of body-worn camera footage, halo footage from the police Air One helicopter, and all of the police radio communications. So all of the communications that went over the police radio channel used by officers during the protests, or at least during the first 5 days. We also interviewed dozens of officers and command staff, other Denver employees, and as I mentioned, community members, and reviewed considerable amounts of academic research and best practice literature and national standards on the policing of large crowd control events. Next slide, please. So among the most controversial subjects concerning the police response was use of force by the police department, sort of overall approaches by the DPD to crowd control, as well as sort of individual allegations and concerns about specific uses of force. And so one of the first things we do in the report is discuss the particular weapons and munitions that were used by the DPD. And we walk through in detail the particulars of those weapons, their technical specifications, the sort of manufacturer warnings about when they can, should, and should not be used. And the tools that were used most often were pepper ball launchers and both sort of active PAVA rounds, so rounds of pepper balls with pepper powder, as well as inert rounds were used by the police department. So rounds that were filled with powder that was not active and did not have a chemical agent inside. 40 millimeter launchers, we have pictures of all of these, by the way, in the report, were used. OC foggers, gas and smoke grenades, rubber ball grenades, and flashbangs or noise flash diversionary devices. Next slide, please. I think one of our most important findings or sets of findings in the report relates to what we have called the internal controls on force that were used by the police department. It is a fact that police agencies tend to struggle in large crowd control events. That's a fact that we've seen borne out in many cities during the George Floyd protests. We've seen it many times before. And so, one of the mechanisms that police departments use to try to, regulate the amounts of force that are used by, or the amounts of force being used by police officers is developing internal systems that kind of measure force and again, sort of regulate when it can and should be used. There's sort of internal accountability mechanisms inside the police department, their management tools, and they're particularly important in crowd control events. And so we look to measure the extent to which the DPD was engaged in the use of those internal controls. And we looked in the report at the tracking of less lethal munitions. So to whom they were being deployed or provided in the field and when they were being deployed by officers, the creation of officer rosters, utilizing or requiring body-worn camera to record uses of force, the prompt preparation of use of force reports by officers, the issuing and recording of orders for crowd dispersal, and the requirement that only officers who've been certified can use particular types of high-risk, less lethal tools. And as we discussed in the report, we found significant gaps and deficiencies in the police department's use of each of these internal controls. Next slide. First, there was really no effective tracking system for the less lethal munitions being used by the police department. There was no log, there was no kind of computer tracking system that measured to whom they were being deployed in the field. There was no system that police managers or command staff could use to evaluate whether particular teams of officers were running through less lethal munitions at disproportionate rates. That is a sort of management tool that police leadership should be utilizing to sort of measure if there's a problem with the way that force is being used by particular officers or particular teams of officers. The fact that there was no effective tracking system also made it incredibly difficult for us to do that kind of analysis after the fact. And so instead of, because we couldn't really measure the volume of munitions deployed on each day, because that tracking system didn't exist, we looked at the DPD's acquisition of munitions. And so we obtained the purchase invoices and purchasing documents associated with each order of munitions placed by the police department during the first 5 days. And the DPD ordered more than $200,000 worth of less lethal munitions during that period. Again, as I mentioned, they were not effectively tracked in terms of who they were being deployed to and the rate at which they were being expended. And so it was really impossible for us in doing this review to determine the quantity used by the police department. I've included a few graphics here at the bottom that are drawn from the report that show the volume that was in the DPD's inventory when the protests began, and then how that volume increased based on the orders placed by the DPD during those first 5 days. Next slide. Another significant gap was in the use of body-worn camera. So early on in this review, we made a large request for documents from the police department. As I mentioned, we received quite a bit of information and had a very good working relationship with the department in providing us with information. However, we did request access to evidence.com, which is the online database in which body-worn camera footage is housed. The DPD did not provide us with access to evidence.com, and instead, on its own, identified videos within that database that were linked to the George Floyd protest and began sending us links to download those videos. And so, over time, over a series of emails and communications, the department sent us links to download 1,218 videos that itself identified as being related to policing of the protests. That was 226 hours of video. We reviewed it all many times. And we were looking for a number of things when we reviewed it. Of course, we were looking at uses of force themselves, trying to evaluate uses of force that we saw on video. But we also wanted to measure how often were body cameras being activated to document uses of force. And that became incredibly challenging, given that many officers simply did not have their body cameras either attached to their protective equipment, which is often called riot gear or turtle suits, or if they did, the cameras were not being routinely activated. For the one day that, so the DPD did not prepare rosters for each of the first 5 protest days. So rosters are an important management tool for tracking which officers are assigned to work, where they're assigned, what skills and certifications they have. It was not until the 5th protest day, June 1st, the DPD actually prepared a roster. And so on that day, according to that roster, there were between 150 and 200 officers working the protest, but we received only footage from only 38 officers for that day. So there was a significant gap between the number of officers who are working and the amount of footage that we were provided. We explore in the report some of the reasons for that, or some of the reasons we believe may have been responsible for that. So some of those reasons concern the ranks of some of those officers. So, not all or most, officers of higher ranks in the department, lieutenants, captains, commanders, and chiefs were not required to wear body-worn cameras, and they represented a portion of that footage gap. But that didn't explain all of it, to be sure. So that was another sort of breakdown in the internal controls during the first 5 protest days. Next slide. Another important system that the department can and should be using is tracking uses of force through the preparation of written use of force reports by officers. So it's sort of well settled and established in policing that when there is a use of force, that the officer who has used force must prepare a written report documenting what he or she saw, what the specific conduct was that caused the use of force, and other observations. And it sort of allows us in my office to provide some scrutiny over each use of force. It allows the police department to track uses of force. It's an incredibly important management tool. And in fact, DPD policy generally requires officers to prepare those reports during their normal patrol duties. During the George Floyd protest, the DPD was not requiring officers to prepare those reports until a lawsuit was filed seeking a temporary restraining order on June the 5th, I believe. And at that point, the department recognized that it had not required officers to create use of force reports. And so on June the 6th, the department began going to officers who had been involved in policing the protests and asking them to create use of force reports, dating back to May 28th. And so there was a sort of concerted effort in the department at that time to create use of force statements, which we reviewed. The department produced to us over 400 use of force statements that were prepared by officers. And our analysis was that they really were insufficient in a number of ways. They were often extremely vague. They were often repetitive, so we would see the same narrative repeated by officers day after day. Often it appeared to be, or not often, but in some cases it appeared to be boilerplate text. And actually officers themselves expressed concern in some of those documents about being asked to go back in time and record uses of force that had happened, in some cases a week or more beforehand. So that was another sort of breakdown that was problematic. Another issue that we uncovered and discussed in the report is the inconsistent recording of crowd dispersal orders. So it is a best practice that when a police agency is going to disperse a crowd with chemical agents or other less lethal munitions, that when possible, it provide warnings to that crowd, that it get on the loudspeaker, indicate that chemical munitions are going to be deployed, provide a route of egress, so provide a route by which people can leave the area if they choose to do that, and warn them that if they don't leave the area, that they will be subject to force and potential arrest. Both best practices and DPD policy are consistent that those warnings, those orders should be recorded. They should be recorded on audio, video. They should be documented in writing when they're issued. Again, the DPD policy is consistent with the national standard on that issue, but they simply were not, to the extent they were issued, they were not routinely documented in audio, video, or in writing by the police department. Next slide, please. And in many cases, they simply were not issued. At least that was our conclusion from having reviewed hundreds of hours of body-worn camera footage and footage provided to us by community members. We saw dozens of interactions between protesters and police, and dozens of situations in which chemical munitions in particular were used by the department to disperse crowds from particular locations. And in only a significant minority of those interactions did we see dispersal orders being provided by the police department. And in some cases, when they were provided, they didn't really comply with the policy or the national standards. They did not include a sort of path, an exit path for folks. They often did not give repeated warnings, sort of a countdown, if you will, which they should when that's possible. It's not always possible, but when it is possible, when there's no unfolding emergency, a countdown should be provided. And so even when they were issued, they were deficient from our perspective and from our analysis. Another issue was officer identification. So the public has a right to be able to identify officers who they've interacted with through, at the very least, a badge number. That's an important sort of accountability mechanism. Based on complaints that have been filed related to the George Floyd protests, as well as our review of video, it was our conclusion that identification was an issue during the protests. I mentioned the 50+ investigations that are currently ongoing related to misconduct complaints. We have already had to dismiss probably now close to several dozen complaints of misconduct, in large measure because we simply were unable to identify the officer who was alleged to have used inappropriate force. That is, the complainant didn't get that person's information on the scene, and given the documentary gaps I've already discussed, we were not able to find it either due to a lack of body-worn video, missing rosters, and other information. So the officer identification and having it easily and clearly visible on the exterior of the riot gear was another issue that we identified and that we discuss in the report. Finally, with respect to this kind of group of findings, but certainly not last in terms of its importance, is the requirement that officers be trained and specially certified to use particular, potentially high-risk, less lethal tools. And we focus in the report on pepperball launchers and 40mm launchers. And the Denver Police Department has a process in place whereby officers can be certified to use those tools. They have to go through a several-hour course to learn about how to use them safely and appropriately. They have to get certified, and I think they have to get some range time, if I'm not mistaken. And so we wanted to evaluate and measure the extent to which the officers who were using those devices during the protest actually had received those certifications. And we found at least 5 cases in which officers stated explicitly that they were not certified, but they were trained once they arrived at the protest. So they were given some kind of emergency field training on the street on those tools when they arrived. Others reported having used those tools, but when we looked at the DPD's internal records on certification, they were not on those certified officer lists. And so it appeared to us to be more than likely that they also, even though they didn't explicitly say that they were emergency field trained, we think it's likely that may have also happened for some of them as well. Next slide, please. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there were 81 officer injuries, and we certainly viewed footage involving police officers being targeted by rocks or other thrown projectiles. and it's my understanding that there are criminal cases pending related to some of those incidents. We also viewed footage of police officers using less lethal weapons against protesters in ways that we found extremely troubling. We saw examples of police officers directing OC spray or pepper ball at persons who were verbally objecting to police behavior and not engaged in any apparent physical resistance. We saw examples of pepper ball being directed at or impacting prohibited areas of the body, the continued deployment of chemical munitions after people were already dispersing or leaving an area. We saw explosive devices thrown at or extremely close to people, sometimes resulting in them being knocked to the ground and suffering apparent injury. And we also saw OC spray being deployed towards the drivers of vehicles or throwable munitions being thrown into lanes of traffic in ways that were seemed to us to be extremely dangerous and also frankly confusing from a tactical perspective. We referred a number of videos as we discussed in the report to the Chief of Police for review and potential investigation in connection with the issues that we observed. Next slide. We also evaluated the policy framework for the less lethal tools being used and made a number of findings and recommendations connected to that policy framework. Firstly, the DPD used a number of two principal high-risk explosive devices. That was rubber ball grenades and flashbangs, as I mentioned. Excuse me. Rubber ball grenades are generally, and I won't sort of go into all of the particulars, but they are grenades that are filled with rubber balls. I think the number in the particular devices used by the DPD is 180 rubber balls. And when the grenade is detonated, those rubber balls are propelled outwards from the grenade body in 360 degrees. And they can travel at a distance of up to 50 feet. And they're different from most of the munitions used by the police department in that they really can't be targeted. So they cannot be, as I mentioned, the projectiles travel outward in 360 degrees. They cannot be targeted at a particular individual. So when they're used in a crowd control situation, they hit, to the extent that one person was to be targeted, they hit that person and everyone else in the vicinity. The body of a rubber ball grenade can itself become shrapnel, and research into the use of that tool raises significant concerns about the risks of eye damage, other soft tissue damage, and even in some extreme cases, potential lethality associated with their use. Flashbangs, people may be more familiar with, and I won't sort of go into the technical details associated with what they are, but both were used during the protest. We have records documenting the use of both, and we've seen video that reflect the use of both explosives during the protest by the DPD. Next slide, please. One of the and I suppose I should say before I move here is, I guess to close the loop on that prior point, DPD policy does not sufficiently articulate a standard for when those high-risk explosives can be used. There are tactical applications that SWAT may use them in, but there's really no sort of policy language that clearly sets forth the standard that the department will follow associated with when they can throw those explosive devices and when they can't. And so one of our recommendations in the report is that they need to articulate such a standard. And with respect to rubber ball grenades, in fact, they need to just disallow them for crowd control in general. They have, from our perspective, no place in the policing of crowd control events. They have no place in the policing of protests. They should be disallowed. And it's my understanding that the department has agreed with that recommendation and will, in fact, ban them for that purpose. Pepper ball, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, there was quite a bit of pepper ball used by the precise amount is impossible to determine at this point, but it was high. Pepper ball has two principal uses. It can be used to saturate a particular area, so it can be fired at the ground near an individual or individuals, or near a wall or another hard object. And when it's used in that way, you know, the pepper ball round explodes, the pepper powder is dispersed, it causes irritation, and people will leave, at least that's the theory, that people will leave that area. But it can also be direct fired, so it can be fired at a person's body. And we saw many of both kinds of uses in the video that we reviewed from the protest. Each use presents different risks. So, you know, area saturation exposes people to, you know, the chemical irritant, but, you know, direct fire exposes people to the pain of impact, and actually it can cause damage. It can create bruising if it hits someone's eye or other kind of, you know, unprotected soft tissue. It can actually sometimes create internal injury. And so the current Denver police policy, or the policy that was in effect at the time of the protest, did not distinguish between those two different applications. It lumped them all together. It permitted the use of pepper ball in the case of defensive resistance, which is as sort of low as blocking traffic. From our perspective, the policy needs to clearly articulate the difference between those two applications, and there needs to be a higher standard associated with hitting someone with a projectile that could potentially do them serious damage in an extreme case. And so we've called on the department to create that distinction in policy and to raise the threshold for direct fire applications. And again, it's my understanding the department has agreed with that recommendation. Next slide. Another important group of recommendations relates to the mutual aid provided by other agencies who came into Denver. The Denver Police Department invited in a number of law enforcement agencies, and actually 18 responded during the protests. That's not uncommon, you know, during crowd control events. It's a relatively common feature of crowd control. When cities have major crowd control events, we see that happen with other police departments in the country. Those 18 agencies primarily sent tactical teams or SWAT teams into Denver with all of the, you know, weaponry and SWAT gear that SWAT teams generally have at their disposal. And so we wanted to evaluate the framework under which that mutual aid was provided. What were the agreements that were in place between those agencies? How had they negotiated in advance what the standards would be for their operations in Denver? How had they negotiated command and control issues to make sure that all of those 18 kind of, you know, diverse police agencies were operating under the same rules? And what we found was that in fact, those agreements simply did not exist. They had not been entered into. There were no mutual aid agreements between the DPD and its 18 law enforcement partners. We made a request for any relevant mutual aid agreements. The DPD provided us with 8. 6 were for agencies that weren't present during the protests, and 2 simply weren't relevant because they concerned matters other than crowd control mutual aid, and so they simply were not relevant to our analysis of the DPD's response to these protests. Next slide. We attempted to assess the kinds of policing done by those agencies in Denver. We did that by obtaining some after-action reports prepared by those agencies and looking at their use of force policies and other associated documents. It was our conclusion that some of those police departments were very active in Denver. They were conducting their own arrests. They were using force of various kinds. Other departments were slightly more passive in that they were asked to protect property or protect firefighters who were responding to fire calls, or defend entry points to the interstate to keep protesters off the interstate. But in assessing the kinds of force used by those departments, it was quite clear that some agencies used less lethal weapons that simply are not approved for use by Denver police officers. So, and we go through this in some detail in the report. Some of the agencies used rubber ball rounds, they used less lethal shotguns, and they used beanbag rounds, all of which have been disapproved for use by the DPD. And so we had concerns about the use of tools by other police agencies on our streets that we have disallowed our own police department from using, or it has itself, I should say, disallowed for its own officers. And another issue that we identified is that those agencies all, of course, have their own use of force policies. So they have their own standards associated with when force can and cannot be used that differ in important ways from the standard in the Denver Police Department's policy. So, and there was really no attempt to harmonize those standards. There was no attempt to come up with a shared approach to establishing a standard for when force could be used on our streets. Another important difference was that not all of the agencies required that officers intervene to prevent inappropriate force. That is a feature, or that was a feature of the Denver Police Department's use of force policy. That was a feature that actually grew out of, in many ways, discussions with the community in the use of force policy task force of several years ago. And it's a key feature for modern police departments. Not every agency had it. Whether or not that had any impact on behavior on the street, there's simply no way to know. Next slide, please. And finally, we also referred a number of issues back to the police department for its own consideration. These were largely operational issues that we identified during our review. I've talked about the specific recommendations that we've made for specific changes, but these were areas that we thought the police department needs to engage in its own analysis and figure out how to fix the problems. We weren't going to prescribe what they should do. We just identified that there were issues that needed to be fixed. First is that in a lot of our interviews with police officers and sergeants, we heard repeatedly that officers didn't always know what they were supposed to be doing out there. They didn't have a clear sense of what their tactical objectives were, didn't always have a clear sense of when they should be using force and when they shouldn't, didn't always have a clear sense of when they should be advancing versus retreating from points of potential conflict with crowds. And given that we heard that over and over again, it was our view that the DPD needs to fix that. Generally in policing of protest, police departments follow an incident command structure. And one feature of incident command is that there is an incident commander who's appointed to set the overall goals and objectives of the protest response. And then an operations chief who's responsible for managing the on the ground sort of tactics being used by officers. And it was our perception that there was a bit of a breakdown in that structure in the protest. Many of the supervisors who we talked to said they had no idea who the operations chief was. They weren't getting the kind of tactical or strategic guidance they needed from an on-the-ground field commander. We think that needs to be fixed by the police department for any future deployments. Another issue we heard repeatedly was that the single radio channel that was used by the department for all communications between officers was often overcrowded and inaccessible. So all police radio communications were consolidated onto a single channel. And the experience that was relayed to us by officers or actually generally sergeants is that when they would try to get on that channel to ask questions of the command post or to request resources, to talk about particular points of conflict, they would attempt to key up, but because there was only a single channel, they would be unable to get access to the airtime. And so they would end up having to make decisions sort of on their own without any kind of centralized, coordinated guidance, which was frustrating for the supervisors and may have had an impact on some of the problems that we saw developing on the streets of Denver. And another issue that we referred back to the police department relates to the frequency and the volume of crowd control and field force operations training. It is, it is key to give officers the training that they need to successfully police a large crowd control event. Some of that training relates to, formations and line formations, sort of technical details associated with the policing of an event like that. Some of it relates to de-escalation. So the training is very important. A lot of the officers we spoke to spoke, very positively of the training they received before the DNC in 2008, and have described a declining sort of volume of this kind of training in recent years. We reviewed records from the Training Academy and corroborated their observations. We corroborated that, in fact, there has been less of the training being provided, and we think that needs to change. The DPD needs to equip officers with the right tools for how to police, these kind of events successfully, and training is an important, a critical piece of that. So I guess I'll end there. And of course, if there are questions or comments, happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. That was, as you can imagine, that's all of that information, which is very concise, is only the first 5 days, which a lot of times when I read that report, I have to wrap my mind around. That was just the first 5 days of not even entire picture of the full time that this was going on. So there's a lot for us to unpack there. There are a number of questions that are out there, and I want to allow the community to ask the questions first. Many of you have already put questions in the Q&A here in the chat here, and Julia Richmond, board member Julia Richmond, has actually been monitoring the Q&A, and she will ask a couple of those for you from the Q&A. However, if you would like to ask your question personally, go ahead and put that in the Q&A, that you have a question that you would like to ask without us reading it out, but you saying it yourself. Just keep in mind that in order to move back and forth, that takes a little bit. We're doing the best we can. So be patient in that process, and I'm going to turn it over to Julia. And then after I've given the community an opportunity to express those questions, then the board, we will ask a few questions after that.
Great,
Julia.
thank you. And I'm just going to read these verbatim. So in some cases, Monitor Mitchell, let us know if that's not an appropriate question for you to answer, and maybe it should have been the Public Safety Department or police force directly. But I'll just read them and you let us know. From an anonymous attendee, what is being done to hold the police criminally accountable for harms done to citizens? Even when they are guilty, they are treated as innocent. This was the whole point of protesting unequal justice between the police and the community.
So thank you for that. That is really a question, there's sort of one principal prosecutor for the city and county of Denver. That's the elected district attorney, Beth McCann. The city attorney has certain prosecutorial powers, but the primary prosecutor who has the ability to charge individuals, including members of law enforcement, is Beth McCann. So that may be a question that's most appropriate for her, given her scope of authority.
From another anonymous attendee, earlier today during the city council meeting, OIM stated DPD doesn't have the radio channels to communicate. To my understanding, there are many channels, but only a few recorded. This literally closes the lines of communication. Being a survivor or DPD clerical errors and oversights, what is the next step to update this? What I believe is an analog system. Second, what is the point of external monitoring if the actions are returned to the IBA? Wouldn't it be better to turn this responsibility over to the FBI or an outside independent agent?
So there was a lot in there, but I'll do my best to respond to all of it. So if I said that during the city council meeting, I apologize. I may have misspoken. It's not that the DP doesn't have additional radio channels. There are many radio channels available to the DPD. There was a management decision by the police command to consolidate all of the communication onto a single radio channel. So it's not a technical issue associated with availability. It was simply a management decision. And in the report, we're reflecting on some of the consequences of that management decision, which we think was problematic in a number of ways. In terms of the oversight of the complaint process, I hear the point. I understand the point. That is the system that we have in Denver. That's the system that's enshrined in Denver law, in the ordinance and the charter, that the OIM does not have the authority to do those investigations on its own, that we must refer them back to the Internal Affairs Bureau of the Police Department. It's a topic that comes up periodically in discussions with city council and in discussions with the community, whether that is the structure that people believe in and want to continue, but that is the current structure. In terms of referring, complaints of misconduct to the FBI, I think the FBI probably has no interest in, I can't speak for them, of course, but I imagine they probably are not interested in picking up that kind of municipal city level responsibility, and they may likely have no jurisdiction to handle that kind of work anyway. But I think there is, this is an issue that comes up frequently, and it's worthy of further discussion by this board and by the city council.
From Megan Ives, can you explain the process by which the complaints made about the police conduct to internal affairs are investigated and dealt with? Does the OIM have any authority to bring penalties / consequences for misconduct against Denver police? And how legitimate is this process?
Yeah, that probably is, relates to the same point that was just raised. We do not have the power to do those investigations. We refer them. We have access to information from inside the Internal Affairs Bureau, so we can be present for interviews that are being conducted. We can recommend additional areas of inquiry, questions to be asked. We have the power, of recommendation. But I think our most important power is the power to create transparency and shine a light on what's happening in the internal affairs process. So we issue routine reports to this board and to the community about what we're seeing in the complaint process, whether it's working or not, whether it's deficient or not, and we will do that work in connection with all of the complaints concerning the George Floyd protests. We will at some point be providing feedback to the public through official reporting about the complaints that were filed, how they were triaged, how they were investigated, and whether or not there was appropriate accountability at the conclusion of the cases. That's the authority we have.
Also from Megan, why are the Denver police allowed to use chemical weapons of war against their own communities? Aren't many of these less lethal weapons banned in international warfare? Are the health consequences of these weapons well understood?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Why are they allowed? I guess because the law hasn't prohibited them from, the law doesn't have a prohibition saying that they can't use them. If that feels like an area that's fruitful for discussion with city council, that may be something you want to pursue, discussions with the council about. Are the health consequences well understood? I think the answer is I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I've heard and read reports of people expressing, serious health consequences that are sort of not disclosed, associated with, the use of CS gas. How good the research is into that, I'm not 100% sure, but it is a concern that I've heard in the community, and I think it's worthy of additional discussion with, potentially with city council representatives.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia.
Yep.
We'll bring it back to the board members at this time, and take a couple from the board members, if you have any questions, and then we'll move back to the community.
I have a question.
Nikki. Sure, Nikki, please.
This is for the Independent Monitor. Mr. Mitchell, in your report, you state that the DPD was able to arrange to have an airplane flown to Wyoming to procure additional munitions from the manufacturer, but nobody was able to procure the tools necessary to allow officers to attach their body-worn cameras to their riot gear. Is there an explanation?
Not from me. I'm not, I can't really answer why. I think you're contrasting the, maybe Herculean efforts to get additional munitions with maybe what would seem like a reasonably easy fix, getting some Velcro to stick the cameras onto the protective gear. I don't really know the answer to that. That may be an appropriate question for the chief to be able to answer. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you.
Julia, Karen, did you have a question? You're on mute. There you go.
Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned in the report that there was a decline in training for the rank and file around the use of munitions and I think probably crowd control. Are you aware of why there has been a decline in the amount of training?
So we interviewed staff from the training academy, as well as others, to get at that very question, Karen. What we heard was that there was a lot of pushback associated with the demands of normal patrol duties, that some of the supervisors in the police department, some of the commanders were concerned about the amount of time being eaten up by all of the training that's required. For police officers to remain certified, they need to go through a certain amount of training each year, as well as the training that's conducted on top of that. And so I think the answer is probably one of resources, and maybe this is a little bit of speculation, but it may be that training kind of got on the bottom of a long to-do list, at least training for these subjects. It's clear to me now that the DPD recognizes that it cannot allow that to happen again. It must prioritize that kind of training, but I think it was largely a question of resources and some supervisors in the department being kind of resistant to having officers out of their patrol duties for lengthy periods of time to receive that training.
Is there that type of training at the academy for the new recruits?
They do receive a small amount of field force operations training and crowd control training. It's not extensive. It is a small amount, and it needs to be refreshed and deepened through continued training throughout their careers. It's really not, from talking to officers, it's really not enough on its own to properly prepare them for an event like the George Floyd protests. It's just not deep or extensive enough.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, as part of your investigation, did you compare, if there was a way to do this, our response with other cities that are comparable in population size and police department size? I'm just curious, and that question has come up a couple of times in terms of best practices. And I know it's kind of hard to define a best practice with something as spontaneous as what took place this past summer. But at any point, were you able to do that, or is that something that's possible, or is maybe that something to look at in the future?
You know, it may be something to look at in the future. You know, we took a look at what some other cities had done, and some of these issues were, I think, common to a number of cities that struggled with how to appropriately balance, you know, the demands of the First Amendment to allow people to mobilize and express themselves with some of what was happening, you know, during the protests. So it didn't go, in many ways, I think it didn't go that well in a number of cities in the United States. There hasn't been a lot of this kind of critical analysis that we've provided in this kind of report produced so far in other cities. Maybe that's coming. If it does, then maybe there'll be some other lessons that can be learned by our city from work that's done in other cities, but I don't think it's been prepared yet.
Absolutely. Thank you.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned in the report that during the 2008 convention, the rank and file seemed to think that there was adequate training for that. Are you aware of who provided the budget for that training for that particular event?
I think some of it was the DPD's own budget, and I think some of it, there were federal grants provided to cities at that time to help prepare for the DNC. At least that's my understanding. So I think there may have been a mix of local money from Denver's budget as well as federal money flooding in to help the city get into a position of readiness for that event.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I think we'll go back to take a couple of more questions from the community. Julia, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Great. A question from Katie Blakely. On Monday, City Council approved a new contract that includes access to evidence.com. Has DPD confirmed open free access to evidence.com by OIM and COB for the duration of the new contract?
No.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
I don't think so. But I mean, I can.
It's quite succinct.
Yeah, they have not. We were not given access to evidence.com for the purposes of doing this review. And, you know, as I said, we were given the ability to download particular video files, and we have not gotten any, you know, commitment from the department to give the OIM access to evidence.com connected to that new contract or otherwise.
Question from Harvey Bowden. The gaps in the delivery of information and lack of transparency as stated in the presentation seems to answer my question. These inconsistencies seem to cover up pertinent info. Who can investigate the police in regards to this?
In terms of, I'm not sure if the question relates to evidence.com in particular or
no, new topic.
New topic. The gaps in the delivery of information. So in terms of our review, we received a lot of information from the police department, and so I would not generally characterize it as not being transparent with us during this review. We did point out significant evidentiary gaps that the DPD simply information that wasn't being kept and should have been by the DPD. I think this is the investigation of that issue. I don't think there's any other investigation of that I'm aware of, unless the city council intends to do something with this report. But I think this is likely the investigation into that issue.
I think my question aligns with a couple others later down is just concern about you not being able to have access to evidence.com. And without that, and somebody kind of referenced cherry picking the videos that got sent to you, which causes some distrust. Yeah,
I understand that. I mean, it would have been a better it would have been better for us to have evidence.com and be able to look at, you know, the audit trails and the back end of that database and see all of the footage with our own two eyes. That's obviously not the position that we were in, but we've heard that concern from a number of people, including a number of council members this morning. And so this may be an appropriate time to revisit that subject with the police department.
A quick question. What is by charter or by statute, what is the police department required to share with you? I mean, is there a mandatory information sharing, or are you purely at the kindness of their hearts as to what information you can receive from them?
Yeah, no, it's not kindness of their heart. It's laid out in the ordinance that empowers the OIM, and in fact, the ordinance was amended in 2015 when there were when my office experienced some problems with obtaining information from one of the departments. We went to City Council to obtain a stronger provision that established a presumption that the OIM would have access to the documents and personnel and information inside the police department and sheriff department. And that provision includes, I believe it includes databases. So there is pretty strong language there already. Even though we've seen, at least in this case, we were not given access to evidence.com.
Okay, a couple of questions. Oh, go ahead, Terrence.
Because of the lack of access to evidence.com, should we ask the City Council? I don't want to put you in that position, but it seems like we should get some clarity from the City Council in terms of an ordinance, or maybe even executive direction from the mayor as to what data is, how that's defined, so that evidence.com is included in the definition of what data is. Because data is pretty broad. So evidence.com probably should fit into data, but I'm just a simple country lawyer, so I'm not really sure.
You and me both. But I think a fair interpretation of the ordinance, as I have read it, is that we should have access to evidence.com. What the kind of appropriate steps for making that happen are, I'm interested in your thoughts about that, but I think the guidance is there.
Sounds like it's an enforcement issue versus access issue. Is that true? The ability to enforce the statute that exists versus clarifying what's in there.
Yeah, or I might frame it as compliance rather than enforcement. But yeah, I think that I think it is maybe a compliance issue.
You had a question from the community.
Questions from Lucy Martin. Were there any instances of Denver police intervening to prevent inappropriate use of force against civilians? And then a follow-up question. I read in the Denverite that Councilwoman Kniech asked whether there was any investigation of targeting of journalists. I'm interested in that as well, and whether there was any investigation of targeting of medics or legal observers. There were several media reports of these targeted assaults on these groups. The last question in this grouping is, does the police department have any response to that, or have they committed to instructing officers not to attack people in these groups?
So regarding the first question, I don't know the answer to whether or not there were instances of DPD officers intervening to prevent the use of inappropriate force. We don't have any record that I'm aware of that occurring. It's not to say it didn't happen, but we don't have any documented record of that happening. In terms of an investigation into the targeting of journalists, as I mentioned during the council hearing this morning, we are involved in a number of investigations that concern those issues. And when those investigations are completed, I think that's something that we'll revisit. We did not find in our interviews or in any of the documents that there was a policy that directed officers to target journalists. Whether it happened, I don't know. We're looking into that in a number of cases. I guess the same answer may relate to medics or legal observers. We did not find any policy guidance that related to the targeting of those individuals. That's not to say that it may not have happened. That's an issue that I think has arisen in some of the investigations that remain ongoing. And then, does the Denver Police Department have any response? I know the chief has indicated that there is some First Amendment training that he has arranged for his officers. I think the board has had some dialogue with the chief about that training before. I don't know what the current status is on that, and when, if it's been delivered, or when the chief is planning to deliver that to the force.
Question from an anonymous attendee. Why was the DPD able to not submit all footage requested by the independent monitor instead of cherry pick footage?
Kind of feels like that may relate to the evidence.com subject we've already discussed.
Okay. From Wes, were there any recommendations in the report that the DPD did not agree with? The current chief style is generally to agree. And number two, is there going to be any follow-up in a year or two to see if the recommendations were actually implemented?
So it's my understanding that the DPD has agreed with all of the recommendations, has raised concerns about the feasibility of requiring all mutual aid partner officers to adhere to the DPD's use of force policy. But I don't think there's sort of an outright disagreement on that subject. And yes, absolutely, there will be follow-up. There must be follow-up to make the report meaningful, to make sure that the recommendations are enacted and people can be kept safer in the event of future protests. There will be and must be follow-up to make sure that they actually get implemented.
I have a couple things, I guess, real quick, and that's, probably the biggest things that jumped out to me in this report are, of course, the body-worn camera piece. And I understand that that's been brought up a couple of times, and the reasoning from the chief earlier this week was that they weren't able to affix the cameras to the different suits that they were wearing for protective gear. That was a big challenge for me, being that it protects the officers, it protects the community. Ultimately, it really protects the city from any type of frivolous lawsuits or ones that are illegitimate or legitimate. A second thing was probably the use of the munitions, the grenades specifically, that fly out in 360 degrees. And I know that in the investigation, most of that was figuring out how it was used. We know that, A, we don't know, they didn't track it, so we don't know exactly how many was used. Keep in mind, this is just the first 5 days. B, we have an issue with the uniform that we need to now find out how to attach these to uniforms. C, it was a dynamic situation and it was difficult to track. But I have to keep coming back to the question in terms of rationale for a lot of this. If we take all of this out and we go for rationale behind why it was used in the first place, or how we can determine the efficacy of using weapons like that, what was the willingness to discuss some of the rationale behind the use? And some of the rationale behind why it was so difficult. Maybe that could give us in the community a better idea of some of these choices. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm just struggling to put my mind around the operational piece.
Yeah, you mean sort of philosophically?
Yeah, just philosophically. I'm just curious, as best as you can. Of course, I don't expect you to, speak for the Denver Police Department.
Yeah, that feels like a good spot for the chief to be heard on. I mean, we certainly heard a lot of explanations during interviews with officers and command staff. I think that, you know, the narrative about the protests is very different depending on who you talk to. And, you know, we heard a lot from officers about violence in the crowds and attacks on police officers. You know, I don't want to be in a position of kind of representing their viewpoint on what happened, but it feels like an appropriate conversation to have with the chief about philosophically why turn to these tools as opposed to other kind of crowd management tactics. You know, I will note that there appeared to be a change in approach by the sort of end of the 5th day and into the 6th day, where we saw in our video the department sort of leaving more space between investors and police. We saw sort of a kind of different approach to some of the potential points of confrontation. And so I think the department, there was some learning happening inside the department at that time, you know, concerning its own tactics and the approaches that it would wanted to use. But I think it'd be good to have some conversation with the chief about that for both for the board and as well as for the community.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, more community questions from Professor Lehman. Have you disaggregated the data for police officers and community/victims by race, gender, etc.?
You know, that's an interesting question. We have that data for the police department in general. We do not have rosters, and so we do not have complete records for all of the police officers who were involved in policing the events. We don't have complete, use of force records, I think. So it would be very hard to do that for police officers. We have some of that data for persons who filed complaints with our office. That is a piece of information that we asked for in our complaint form. I will say though that it's often not completed. It's often not filled out, and so I think our data for the community would be incomplete on that question as well. So that's not something we've looked at in particular. I think it is an interesting question, but I think the data would be incomplete both for officers and for the community.
From an anonymous attendee, do you think SB 2217 will help the OIM address body cam access or its findings to address officer abuse? If not, what supplemental department policy or legislative action do you recommend to make body cams use effective without the fiscal note that already exists?
Good question. I'm not sure if SB 2217 will help, because a lot of the issues related to body cameras, addressed in the bill were already sort of incorporated into DPD policy. So I'm not sure that bill will have a significant impact on the Denver Police Department in the same ways that it may impact other law enforcement agencies in Colorado. Someone brought up the recent new contract regarding body-worn camera that was inked by the City Council. I think there are very interesting kind of technological innovations that would address some of the problems that we've, there have been multiple times in which my office has issued reports about problems with body-worn camera activation. And I think some technical fixes will address some of that. The chief announced that body cams under the new contract will activate whenever an officer's weapon is withdrawn from the holster. I think that's a nice innovation. But in reality, weapons are not drawn or pointed that often by police officers. The vast majority of police work, the vast majority of uses of force don't involve guns, they involve hands. And so if the goal of making a technological change to body cameras is to make sure that uses of force get recorded, tying that to to the weapon coming out of the holster is really an incomplete solution. There are other settings and technologies that can be applied that, for example, will automatically activate the body-worn camera anytime an officer steps out of his or her patrol vehicle, whether kind of the camera is linked to the car, and then it can be, it can be turned off if the officer is going into a private area or needs to use the restroom. But I think there are some interesting kind of technological changes that should be explored to fix these activation problems. Whether additional legislation is needed, I'm not sure. I think it's an interesting question. Maybe someone could do some research into other legislation around the country that could address some of these issues. But offhand, I'm not sure the answer to that.
Julia, to bring in a question from our online community, I'm going to ask a question that Twitter user William Paul Colgan posted. When we were discussing access to evidence.com, he said, why didn't the OIM contact the city attorney to force compliance? Mr. Mitchell, could you discuss the relationship between the safety departments, the mayor's office, council, and the independent monitor? Who gives who legal advice? Who decides what to enforce and what not to?
We're every city agency, and the OIM is an agency of the city government, receives legal advice from the city attorney's office. So the DPD receives legal advice from the city attorney's office, and so do we. That is the kind of the structure that's in place. Frankly, I'm not sure if the city attorney knew about the evidence.com issue. It was not something that, while the investigation was ongoing, and once we started getting documents and conducting interviews, my focus shifted to trying to digest a huge volume of evidence to be able to do this project quickly. And so I didn't go to the city attorney with this issue, to try and get some, an order or something to require the police department to give us access to evidence.com. It's certainly something I could have done, but I prioritized other work and other issues that I was addressing. But in general, it is the city attorney and her subordinate lawyers who provide advice to both my office as well as the DPD.
So to make sure I'm clear, the city attorney, which is a mayoral appointee, is the same lawyer who would be tasked with defending the police departments. They're the same lawyer that would interpret what you have access to under the ordinance. Everybody's got the same counsel, essentially.
That's correct.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, more community questions. Nick Downey asks, between mutual aid from other departments and non-resident DPD officers, roughly how much city funding was bled out to the suburbs over the course of these events, i.e. salary/overtime paid to officers that will not be recouped through Denver property and sales tax, etc., but will rather bolster the economy, schools, infrastructure where officers actually live? I'm not advocating for residency requirements because those do not improve police-community relations, but instead we need to figure a figure for how much of our budget is improving surrounding municipalities while our own suffers.
So my understanding is that the DPD was not required to pay, or Denver was not required to pay officers who provided mutual aid during the protests. I could be wrong about that. I know that at least in terms of the munitions that were expended by those agencies and provided, I've been told that there was no sort of bill due from Denver associated with those expenditures. In terms of overtime, certainly there was overtime paid, or I believe there to have been overtime paid by the department to DPD officers. I don't know what that number is. We didn't really investigate the finances here. That feels like an appropriate, subject for the city council. And in fact, I know several council members who've expressed similar concerns and questions about, the finances, and they may be interested in looking into that, but that's not something that we look into.
From an anonymous attendee, it seems pretty clear that in some ways DPD had little organization and no clear strategy as to why they were even present during the protests. To the monitor and COB's knowledge, are there any models or theories of responding to large demonstrations without police that you can speak to? And what, if anything, does this report mean should change about the broader approach DPD takes towards crowd control events, given the apparent disorganization and negative consequences of their approach?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know that it has a clear answer, but I think it's an important question. You know, I would say that there did appear to be a change in some of the tactics that we saw being used by the police department as the protests wore on. Again, we saw kind of more distance. We saw less intervention. We saw reduced number of arrests. We saw fewer uses of less lethal munitions by the department. We saw skirmish lines and officers being stationed kind of farther away from the site of protest activity. I think those are all important tools. We talk about de-escalation in individual uses of force, the need to de-escalate, and distance is one of the sort of primary de-escalators, time and distance, giving things an opportunity to cool down, reducing the opportunities for the use of force. And so I think the same principle applies with the kind of overall approach to crowd management. I think there's room for more discussion with the department about that, how to, if that worked well, if that worked better in the kind of waning days of the protests, how could that be kind of, established, or how could they create some additional tools and philosophies to make sure that's the approach they take in general for any future, mass protest events. I think the question asked about protests that involve no police. I'm not aware specifically of a protest, an approach that involves no police at all. It may be out there, but I'm not aware of it. I think having police who are, as far away as possible is probably a good thing, and worth having more discussion with the police department about how to make that happen.
One of my questions, Nick, is, my peer, friend, comrade, Vinny Cervantes pointed this out today. We've had other protests against police brutality with Paul Castaway, thinking about Michael Marshall. So what changed with this, where it did escalate with the degree of police presence being there?
I think the police department will say it was the crowd behavior. They will, distinguish those events from this event in terms of the, level of violence or the level of anger at the police. That may be a partial answer. That may not be, a good answer. There may be a lot of things that distinguish those protests from this one. This, of course, unfolded in the middle of a pandemic and kind of, during or after a major lockdown. There were a lot of factors that probably influenced officer behavior as well as crowd behavior. I'm not aware of a specific change inside the police department, a philosophical change between those protests and this one. There's no sort of clear line that we were able to identify that indicated that they had adopted a more aggressive philosophy towards policing protest. But I think there were probably a lot of factors that influenced both crowd and officer behavior.
Nick, if you were to prioritize, if you had a crystal ball and you were able to prioritize taking all of these different suggestions, and you could think of the top three that your office has probably worked on and given in this report, what would those top three be? Because, if things move as if they always have, we don't expect a lot of this list to be done in a short amount of time. But if we can walk away, and I'm interested in what you perceive as three impactful changes from this list that as a community and as a board that we could be more aware of and ones that we could take in bite-sized chunks?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. To some extent, I might kick that one back over to this board and to the community. I feel like my role was to do, I have a certain kind of technical knowledge and expertise. My role was to provide this information, to reflect on what went wrong and equip the community with information that it can use. And, what the priorities are, I think maybe a kind of a community question for folks to say what they think is most important. Certainly some of the recommendations are easy and can be addressed yesterday. Banning rubber ball grenades. If a protest erupts tomorrow, I expect to see no rubber ball grenades being deployed in Denver. Some of the policy changes and fixes can and should have already been taken care of by the department. The bigger kind of philosophical questions, questions about, many of the other recommendations, I think I would, kind of put it back on the community to get everyone else's thoughts about what's most important right now. Certainly training needs to increase, and it needs to increase, quickly to put the department in a better position if something else, unfolds like the George Floyd protests.
Absolutely, thank you.
A question from an anonymous attendee. I've witnessed police officers remark to protesters while they're under arrest, take it up with the independent monitor if you don't like the way I'm treating you. Do you think that the independent monitor has the necessary power to oversee rogue police officers and enforce the community standards? Do you think that your office is balanced to the corrupt powers at work? If not, what do you need to get these actors in line?
Yeah, that's interesting. Take it up with the independent. I've actually seen that on body camera footage. Do I think we have the necessary power? That's a question that comes up repeatedly. I think issues have already been raised on this call about other powers that, we should have access to information. We should have, there have been questions about, legal advice, things that could be done to ensure kind of true independent operation of the office. I know the council is interested in looking at legislative change to address some of those issues. So I think this is an evolving system. It's an evolving structure. We're always finding out new issues that need to be corrected. And I think we've identified some of them on this call already.
A question from Caleb Munro. It's heartening that, according to news reports, DPD has said that it agrees with the 16 recommendations in the OIM report. But what process exists to track progress and hold them accountable? Does OIM play a role in assessing implementation of these changes down the road?
I think we will have to. I think to make it meaningful, to provide some measure of assurance to the public, I think the OIM will have to do that work. I think there will have to be a follow-up report to the community. The department has said that it's planning to create an online dashboard to keep the public apprised of changes it's making. But I think it'll be incumbent on us to obtain documents and obtain other information and sort of validate whether or not those changes are meaningful and have been appropriately made. So I would say to expect more from the OIM on that issue.
Julia, I actually have a question for our board chair in follow-up to the previous question about the OIM having the power and authority to check potential police abuses. Al, could you speak a little bit about the role of the COB as distinct from the role of the OIM in terms of advocating for our oversight system, and maybe how the community can get in touch with us if they have ways they'd like to see the oversight system function differently?
Sure, and thank you, Nikki. And you know what? I'll start with this, giving a couple of ways that the community can reach us. Let me start with that. So there are a couple of ways that you can get in touch with us. One is on Facebook. So if you go to facebook.com/DenverCOB, and through our newsletter, which you can sign up for on Facebook as well. That's a great way to keep track of what we're doing in the community and what types of issues that we're focused on, as well as Twitter at Denver_COB. You know, from the COB perspective, our main leverage is the voice of the community, and our ability to bring the community together in a voice that speaks to those that are in office and in charge, such as the sheriff and the chief and the director of safety. And that is our strongest tool that we have in the toolbox of ensuring, to the question that we got earlier about ensuring that change is taking place and it is trackable. The OIM, the independent monitor, has access to the information. And then part of our job as a Citizens Oversight Board is to make sure that we're a voice out there to the community and to the powers that be, that the community is concerned and we are watching, and we do have a vested interest in the independent monitor having access to all the information they need. We go back to the evidence.com question. How then do we ensure that the independent monitor has access to all of the information that he needs? That's part of our job from the COB, is to address, to challenge, and to engage those folks in the city that can ally themselves along with us and the community to ensure that we have full access. So really our job is to come alongside the OIM in standing in proxy for the community to ensure that we're getting access to all the information that we need and that change is truly happening in the way that it should be happening. And in another aspect, those rules that are on the books already, those things that we should be doing, when we meet with the director of safety, when we meet with the sheriff, when we meet with the chief of police, is to ask those questions then, why aren't they being done? Or in cases where they are, thank them for continuing to give us the right access and when things are being done right as well.
Thank you, Al. And I want to highlight a comment in the Q&A from Dee DePerson, who sits on the nominating committee from the COB, who says they're actively recruiting for vacant positions if folks are interested in serving.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more, I'm guessing, from the community. I'm happy we're getting so much participation tonight, which is great. Julia is working her fingers to the bone, trying to toggle back and forth and fill in. So it's been great.
Thanks. April is going to cover a couple of the questions about next steps. There are a few in there.
Yeah, first Alice has, what are punitive measures taken after these serious activities have been discovered? And if so, who will follow up?
Yeah, so that probably relates to the ongoing internal affairs investigations. The punitive measures could be discipline, you know, up to and including termination. And we will follow up on all of those cases to make sure that they're, you know, appropriately investigated and report back to the community on the outcomes.
And kind of similar, I'll blend to the first being, you know, Penny's asking, I guess, you know, you, Nick, and us, what are next steps for DPD regarding this report? And then how are people of Denver expected to respect and trust DPD after understanding the violent, unaccountable ways in which they operate?
Anyone on the board want to tackle that second question?
I could easily give an answer, but I'm gonna give someone else a chance to answer that.
I think that's a question for the department itself.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, and that's why I wish that the chief had been on here tonight, because I knew that there would be a lot of questions to that area. I can only say from the COB's perspective that we are definitely in tune with the type of questions and the sentiment that's coming from the community, because right now, the law enforcement period works at a trust deficit. And part of all of our jobs is to try to cure that deficit. But unfortunately, we can't answer for them tonight.
And another one that might help guide our question a little bit comes from Stan, who attends our regular kind of Friday meetings. First, he says, I certainly appreciate the efforts of Mr. Mitchell and the OIM. Can the COB comment on other organizations like the Transformation Group or Reimagining Group that are concerned with these topics? I know a few of us, when we were arranging this community forum, have discussed another forum at the beginning of next year to invite some various stakeholders who have been having these conversations to that forum. So I know that's one thing that we have planned for first quarter of next year, but I don't know if there's any other comments from us.
April, I think it just bears mention that we're always grateful for engaged community members, no matter what committee they assemble themselves into, or volunteer group or not-for-profit. We need everybody at the table. So we look forward to learning more about their work and their perspectives.
Yeah, you know, that constant engagement from the community is really where the strength of not just COB, but even as you talk about reimagining police, which we're fully aware of at the COB, and although we're not driving that effort, we're definitely behind that effort and understanding ways that we can improve it. And so I would say that to Nikki's point, the ability to stay engaged and to bring other community members into the conversation so that we can be proactive with things and not wait until there's a George Floyd incident before we start looking at policies and procedures. But if we stay engaged all year and stay engaged as best we can use that accountability arm all throughout the year and not just when crisis takes place. Any other questions? Probably take one more, I'm guessing, from the community before we adjourn.
Maybe there are two quick questions.
Okay, sure.
The first is a couple of questions related to the function and form of the OIM. How many people total work for / dedicated to OIM, and how many employees worked on this report? And then the second question is, can you speak to the nature of injuries police officers sustained during the protest?
So regarding the first question, we are 15 employees total, divided into kind of 3 primary areas. So my team of monitors who are lawyers. We have several policy analysts on our staff, and we have an outreach team that works on outreach events and issues. How many employees worked on the report? Probably 7 or 8, serving in different roles. Some folks working on, review of video. Some folks focusing on review of radio communication. Other folks helping me with interviews I was conducting. So it was probably 7 or 8 total, I would estimate. In terms of the injuries to police officers, I think they kind of spanned the range. Some officers were hit by a moving vehicle and I think sustained some pretty serious injuries. Other officers were hit by, rocks and other projectiles and sustained, soft tissue damage and maybe even, some broken bones in some cases. So I think there was really a range, you know, for all the way from, you know, just bruising all the way to serious injuries, in particular in connection with the, you know, the vehicle incident.
Mr. Mitchell, on the first question, can you talk about the size of your office relative to the size of the safety departments?
The police department is probably 1,500 sworn officers and many other civilian employees. The sheriff department, which we also oversee, maybe around 900-ish sworn deputies and many other civilian employees. The executive director of the Department of Safety is a large team, sort of helping him to oversee the safety agencies. I don't know how big that team is. It's certainly bigger than the OIM. So from, you know, in terms of scale, you know, we're extremely small in terms of the scale of the agencies that we oversee.
In its open letter in response to the death of George Floyd of policing in Denver on June 5th, the second recommendation made by the COB was that Denver consider funding its oversight agencies by pegging oversight budgets to police expenditures. And I think that speaks to the different sizes of the departments and what you've been tasked with.
Yeah, it's a huge point. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Julia, for filling all those questions, and you, April, as well, for doing that. Thank you to the community. And before we adjourn, I just wanted to say that we're incredibly fortunate in this city to have such a capable and smart group of people in the COB. Your Citizens Oversight Board really does do a lot of work behind the scenes. And keep in mind, we are all volunteers, and we all do this because we simply are looking to do things the best way that they can possibly be done, and to make sure that the community is being heard at the table, not just a seat at the table, but a voice at the table, and go beyond being a voice, but actually making change. We're also fortunate to have Nick Mitchell as our independent monitor, who I think has done a good job with this report and created a good roadmap. Now, to his point, the work is for us to do, not just the COB, us being the community. And I can promise you that we will be reaching out to hear your voice as we prepare to try and set up what's priority for us over this next coming year. The schedule, we will figure out when our next quarterly public forum is, especially with COVID and, you know, the way that things are kind of changed up now with our timing. So I ask you to bear with us from that perspective. But there again, stay connected with us over Facebook and get busy in our newsletter. And we hope to see you on first and third Fridays. Thank you. Be safe and good night.